Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. So, in my late teens and early 20s, I wore the same baseball hat every day. Literally, every day, for years. It was a white hat. It had a black and red swine-like character on it, and in big bold letters boasted the team nickname, Hogs. For the super Jew that I was, raised at Hillel Day School in a kosher home, attending shul every Shabbat, president of my BBYO chapter, Brandeis student, it was a bit ironic, if not outright rebellion, and it's about as far as I strayed from the straight and narrow. But that hat, in some weird way, was almost holy to me. It was part of my daily wear, and without it I felt naked and incomplete. Nowadays, it's my wedding ring that occupies that space in my life. While the band itself is simple, its symbolic meaning obviously is quite important to me. And if I'm ever not wearing it, something just feels off. So in this week's Parsha, Tzav, we find the specific instructions delivered to Aaron and his sons as to how to perform the ritual sacrifices. In particular, we learn about a few different types of offerings. We learned that the priesthood would be passed on to Aaron's descendants. We learned that we're not permitted to eat certain animal fats. The Bible was ahead of its time as it related to eating healthily, like take that, Dr. Atkins, right? And we also learned that eating blood is not permitted. B'chol dam lo tochlu b'chol moshvotechem la'of ve'labehema. And you must not consume any blood, either of bird or of animal, in any of your settlements. Kol nefesh asher tochal kol dam v'nichreta ha'nefesh hahi me'amea. Any soul who eats blood, that soul shall be cut off from its nation. There's a reason kosher meat is soaked and salted as part of its preparation. It's to draw out the blood. We actually first received this instruction back in Genesis, when God is instructing Noah and his family what they're permitted to eat and not eat after the flood. And the rationale for why actually comes in our Torah reading a couple of weeks from now, spoiler alert, where we read, Ki nefesh kol basar damo benafshohu, va'amar livnei Yisrael dam kol basar lo tochelu, ki nefesh kol basar damohi kol ochlav yikaret. For the soul of all flesh, its blood is its soul. Therefore I say to the Israelite people, you shall not partake of the blood of any flesh, for the soul of all flesh is its blood. Anyone who partakes of it shall be cut off. So blood isn't something we're meant to consume. But the reason given in the Torah isn't because blood is somehow disgusting or impure. Rather, it's because the blood is directly linked to the soul or life force of the creature. It's because blood is holy. Now we see blood used in a holy capacity at the end of this week's Torah portion, as Moses anoints Aaron and his sons, and also anoints their vestments. And they then begin their duties as the Israelites' designated priests. Here's the quote. And Moses took some of the anointing oil and some of the blood that was on the altar, and sprinkled it upon Aaron and upon his vestments, and also upon his sons and upon their vestments. Thus he consecrated Aaron and his vestments, and also his sons and their vestments. Now, first of all, this image is a little bit unreal to me. As a means of anointing Aaron and his sons, Moses literally sprinkles not only oil, but blood on them. Blood which we know is not kosher and not to be eaten. Blood which had polluted the Nile in Egypt. Blood which, in case you haven't heard, sometimes stains clothing. Now, I read this section and I said to myself, my usual vision of the priests as barbecue pitmasters is actually somewhat off. Because as messy as that work is, this job also entailed the slaughtering and harvesting of the animals. Way messier. And second of all, I'm fascinated with the concept of anointing vestments, clothing. The notion that otherwise mundane clothing can be spiritually uplifted via a ritual process is intriguing to me. And for what it's worth, I'm pretty sure I drafted most of this sermon while wearing jeans and a sweatshirt. Not the holiest of garb. So I think back to the baseball hat that I wore every day for years, and I have a hard time remembering what it was that made it so special and out of the ordinary, other than the fact that wearing it daily became a ritual in and of itself. There definitely wasn't a moment where oil or blood was sprinkled on it with intention, although admittedly wearing a white hat for years does allow for some stains to take root. Now, our tradition is one that creates space for making otherwise mundane garments holy. Think, for example, of the difference between a rectangular piece of fabric and of the same piece of fabric now containing fringes on the four corners, making it a talit. Think of the garments that we use to clothe our Torah scrolls, such as a belt, known as a girdle, and a cover, known as a mantle. While in and of themselves ordinary, serving to protect and beautify, by virtue of covering our sacred objects, these garments take on an elevated status of holiness in our minds. Should the clothing we wear be any different? One of my favorite midrashim comes from Leviticus Rabbah, and it roughly translates to something like this. Rabbi Abba Bar Yudan taught, all that God prohibited in animal sacrifice, God accepts in a human being. What is prohibited in a sacrificial offering? Well, when a person offers from the herd of the flock a sacrifice of well-being to God, to be acceptable, it must be without blemish. There must be no defect in it. Anything blind, broken, or maimed, or with a wart, you're not allowed to offer to God as part of a sacrifice. So what's Rabbi Abba Bar Yunan saying? He's saying that all of those things that make a sacrifice unfit, God fully accepts as fitting in human beings. That as human beings, we are all holy, broken vessels, and yet we are still infinitely precious in the eyes of God. Now, holding that imagery for a moment, is there a reason that we should treat ourselves and our adornments differently than we do those that cover our Torah scrolls? What would it be like to truly view ourselves as holy vessels and to elevate what we consider to be routine and mundane, such as our clothing, to a higher status? Would we bring more intention to offering blessings as we put on our clothes each morning? Would we express gratitude to them as we take them off? Would clothing end up crumpled on the floor, as it often does in my house, instead of being hung nicely or placed in the hamper? Many of our own ancestors had to flee their homes with just the clothes on their backs, and many others are doing so today. Our traditional morning blessings include a blessing that expresses gratitude to God for clothing the naked. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam malbish arumim, which the Talmud teaches us we're meant to say as we get dressed each day and put our clothes on. But the reality is that there are still many who don't have the clothes they need, and that of those of us who do, we're often not appreciative enough of them. So this Shabbat, I'd like to invite us to take stock of our wardrobes, to examine our relationship with clothing, to feel gratitude for having clothes at all, let alone having choices of what to wear beyond just the clothes on our backs, to consider donating some of our lightly worn items to help others, and most importantly, to recommit ourselves to viewing those whose clothes may be dirtied with oil, blood, or any other kind of schmutz as holy, just as the priests were, and to withhold the desire to somehow judge them as lesser than. Simply by virtue of our wearing them, even when stained, our garments can, if we allow them to, take on an elevated holy status, even if they say hogs on them. And why? Because they're being worn by us. Shabbat Shalom.